Welcome to session 3 of Awesome Ideas in Judaism. Today we're talking about Halakhah. And just a little upkeep before we get started. Want to remind you of the kind of format of each session. First, we'll begin with a definition of the idea. We're tying in here to Rabbi Arthur Green's book, Judaism's 10 Best Ideas. We'll explain and expand on some of the sources and the ideas that Rabbi Green brings in his chapter. And then we'll connect it at the end in a direction usually Rabbi Green doesn't necessarily take all the way through, to Jewish life and practice. And particularly, I think in the context of Beit, this is a really interesting idea to talk about. And as we'll explain later, connecting this one to Jewish life and practice is a little bit different than some of the others. You're welcome to ask questions along the way. All you got to do is take yourself off of mute, use that mute button in the bottom left. That'll usually bump you up to the top of my participants list, and I'll know you have something to say, and I can just call on you that way. You can also use the hand raise button if you open your participants tab. There should be a button that says raise hand. That'll also bump you to the top of my list, and I'll know you have something to say. You can also type questions in the chat if you're either in a loud place or just want to type your questions out. You're also welcome, and this has happened before, have kind of a running side conversation during class as well. And the chat is a great place to do that. You're welcome to, respond to any of my prompts, share your own thoughts, especially in that last section when we get to talking about connection to Jewish life and practice. This gets a lot better the more we get to interact. All right. So Rabbi Green begins his chapter on Halakhah, which he calls Walking the Path, and we'll talk about why he uses that subtitle in a moment. But he begins, like you can see on the screen there, Judaism it sees itself as a path of praxis, and the Jews, or Israel, as a human community that lives in accord with God's Torah, as passed on, refined, and interpreted by an ongoing body of teachers and students. So there's a good bit to unpack here, actually, in terms of what Rabbi Green actually means in this definition of Halakhah. And I think a good starting place is those words, God's Torah. What do we mean by God's Torah? So a lot of folks, when they hear the word Torah, think of the Torah scroll, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible that are bound up on parchment and live in the Aron Kodesh, the Holy Ark in the synagogue. That's one definition of Torah. I like to call that sort of the capital T Torah when we talk about the Torah. That's usually what we're talking about. But here, even though Rabbi Green capitalizes the T in Torah, we're talking a bit more about the more expansive sense of the word Torah. So it should come as no surprise, I would hope, that there are questions about proper behavior that we can ask today about which the Torah, capital T Torah, is in the 5 books of Moses, simply read and tried to be understood at the level of its plain meaning. There are questions we can ask from our point of view today that the Torah just can't help with. Now, for example, something like, can I use a computer on Shabbat? The Torah itself has no idea what a computer is. Something like, is that new kind of meat that's grown in a vat, is vat-grown meat kosher? The Torah simply has no frame of reference on meat outside of, the kind of meat that comes from an animal. It's way beyond the biblical imagination. So from its plain sense, the Torah doesn't, on the surface, have much to say that can help us answer those kinds of questions. Now, it may come as a little bit of a surprise, however, to learn that there are questions that were asked 2,000 plus years ago that the plain sense of the Torah was actually similarly unable to help address. Things like, what am I supposed to bind upon my hand and make a symbol before my eyes? In that paragraph we read as part of Halakhah now, that comes from the Torah. That paragraph does in itself say exactly what it says. You're supposed to bind them, but what is them? Can I eat milk and meat together? The Torah is never actually explicit on that point. We learn a verse that we should not boil a kid in its mother's milk, but how we get from one to the other, well, it's a matter of interpretation. How can I worship God properly when sacrifice is impossible? Basically, all the Torah knows about worship of God has to do with sacrifice. How do I pray? The Torah doesn't actually understand prayer the same way we do. There are characters in the Torah who do pray. It uses the word lehitpalel, something like to intercede, but it's not totally clear that that's the same as what we're talking about today when we pray. So there are questions asked even way back then that needed additional interpretation. The Torah as is understood within its traditional framework to be the content of the revelation to Moses at Sinai. But it's also been evident all along that the written Torah on its own doesn't actually serve as a suitably comprehensive guide for our behavior. As long as there's been a written Torah, it's been accompanied by a continual explication and interpretation, attempting to answer some of the questions like the ones I just posed. And the traditional content of that explication and interpretation, which was transmitted orally, actually quite an effective mode of transportation or of transmission in an era before writing and literacy were really widespread. So Jewish tradition understands there to actually be two Torahs, the written Torah and the oral Torah, this body of interpretation, explication that goes along with the written Torah. And the answers to some of those questions, some of which you might know, what do we bind upon our hands and let be a symbol before our eyes? We know now the Torah is talking about tefillin. That's not explicit in the Torah. That came about through this process of oral interpretation. So when the sages of about the 2nd century, late 2nd, early 3rd century of the Common Era, sought to preserve this oral tradition, they realized that, once Jews were dispersed throughout the world in the diaspora, the chain of transmission, like the oral chain, necessitates people being in close proximity so that they can tell each other these traditions. With everyone so spread out, they knew they needed to write it down. And so they composed Mishnayot, pieces of the Mishnah. We'll talk about what that is in just a moment. Like this one, for example, you can see on your screen source number 1 there from Pirkei Avot, that's Tractate Avot, the sayings of the fathers from the Mishnah. And it begins, the whole tractate of the Mishnah begins with sort of an outline of this chain of oral transmission. So Moses received the Torah at Sinai, transmitted it to Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. So those men of the Great Assembly were who the rabbis understood to be their immediate predecessors. Whether that was an actual institution known as the Great Assembly or not is fairly unlikely, but the rabbis knew that the traditions they knew came from somewhere, so they sort of attributed to this group who they called the men of the Great Assembly. When they talk about Torah in this Mishnah, they're not just talking about the written Torah. They're not just talking about the 5 books of Moses. They're talking about the whole body of interpretation. And that's evident because of what follows. They said 3 things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. Now, none of those are written in the written Torah. And in fact, the last one, make a fence around the Torah, refers back to the Torah, right? So they knew of this ongoing oral tradition that accompanied the written. And when they traced its lineage, when they traced its chain of transmission back, they actually connected it all the way back to Moses at Sinai as well. So in other words, both the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and its traditional interpretation are held up in Jewish tradition as authoritative in an effort to determine exactly how the life of Torah was to be practiced in ever-changing particular circumstances. Those are Rabbi Green's words. Okay. So the first definition of Halakhah that we're going to work with today, Rabbi Green basically defines in his chapter. He defines Halakhah as the normative praxis of Judaism. Now, praxis, admittedly, is not a word I use all the time, so I went and looked that up. Praxis means customary practice or conduct. Now, Halakhah is often translated as Jewish law. But, as Rabbi Green points out, it literally means walking. It refers to a path or a way of walking in the world, halakhah, from a verb that means to walk or to go. And it's derived from this source on the second page of our source sheet today, Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12, where it reads, "And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God demand of you? Only this, to revere the Lord your God, to walk in God's ways, to love God, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and soul." And I bolded that key part there, walk in God's ways. The Hebrew for that is lalechet b'kol drachav. So lalechet, you can hear the lech of halakhah. That's the word that means to walk or to go. Now, that's, a lovely verse, of course, but what does that actually mean, walking God's ways? It probably has something to do with what we read in another chapter of Deuteronomy, source number 3 there, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 28, where it says, "Be careful to heed all these commandments that I join upon you. Thus it'll go well with you and with your descendants after you forever, for you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God." So it's probably something like that. What's good and right is what God wants from us, and that's what the Torah understands as walking in God's ways. It also probably has something to do with a concept called imitatio Dei, which is a Latin term. This idea was developed in Christianity as well, but it means imitation of God. Basically, the idea is we should do what God does and what we read about God doing in the Torah and what we understand God to do in the world. And there's a great example here in Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 5. It's, you can get a sense of the content of Deuteronomy. This is the great place to pull all these quotes from. But it says, "Follow after the Lord your God. Acharei Hashem Elohechem telechu." Like, again, that lech of halakhah. You should walk, you should follow after God. Revere none but God, observe God's commandments alone, heed only God's orders, worship none but God, and hold fast to God. Okay, but how are we supposed to do that? The rabbis understood imitatio Dei, that idea that we should follow after God and sort of act the way God does, in a way that I think is really nicely illustrated by this source that I brought here from the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Sota. And it says, Rabbi Chama, son of Rabbi Hanina, says, "What is the meaning of what is written? Follow after the Lord your God." You could tell they're about to introduce an interpretation of this verse. I snipped a little bit to make this fit on the page, but he explains that what it means is one should follow the attributes of the Holy One of Blessing. And so he provides several examples. Just as God clothes the naked, as it says, God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skin and clothed them when they were naked in the Garden of Eden, so too you should clothe the naked. Just as the Holy One of Blessing visits the sick, as it's written with regard to God's appearing to Abraham following his circumcision, when he was almost certainly, homebound, God appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre. So God showed up to visit the sick, to visit Abraham when he was ill, so too we should visit the sick. God consoles mourners. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son. Similarly, we should imitate God and console mourners. And on and on. God buries the dead. It says he was buried in the valley of the land of Moab. We're talking about Moses here at the end of his life. So too, you should bury the dead. So here we have just, a short list from Rabbi Chama, his interpretation of the verse, but you get the idea for where this idea that we should follow God, we should walk in God's ways, sort of the concept that's building here. We should do what's good and right, but also do these other things that sort of embody these other attributes of God. It's not a matter of just, avoiding, lying, cheating, stealing, and being honest. It's a matter of, beyond that, acting in a really well-rounded, positive way. The way we see God acting in the Torah. Okay, that's great. We understand, on one level what halakhah is, what it means to walk in God's ways, but how do we do that? This is well short of being any sort of comprehensive guide to our behavior. We need more guidance. both in ethical terms, but also in matters of ritual. As we noted, things change a lot in response to changing circumstances. For example, worship of God that was focused around sacrifice became impossible with the destruction of the temple. We need to figure out how to do that in a post-temple world. We need more guidance, right? So basically a kind of process began. And as we noted, going all the way back, before the era of the rabbis, but which we only sort of see start to play out beginning in the rabbinic era when they started writing things down. It's almost basically impossible to know what the chain of transmission was like before the written era. So for our purposes, it begins with the rabbis, although we know it went back further than that. We see this kind of process beginning where questions are raised and they're discussed by scholars in great detail. The answers get recorded, first, like we said, orally, then later on in writing. Those answers are then compiled and codified in order to facilitate learning by subsequent generations. And those generations then learned what their predecessors said, raised their own questions, discussed those questions and recorded their answers, and so on and so on. It becomes this process of constantly reevaluating the interpretation and readapting it to changing circumstances, and forging new paths that have not been explored yet in terms of how humans, and specifically Jews, should behave in the world. So we come then to another functional definition of halakhah beyond what Rabbi Green talks about as the practice of like the act of doing customary Jewish practice. There's another way that halakhah is used, and Rabbi Green touches on this in his book, but I thought it would be worthwhile to make it explicit in our discussion. Halakhah is effectively the collective body of Jewish religious thought as to how a Jew ought to behave. So halakhah is on one level, the first definition, basically what a Jew does in a traditional sense. And it's also the collection of thought, and by that I mean literature, about how Jews ought to do halakhah. Both are basically referred to as halakhah. Halakhah is normative practice itself, but like I said, can also refer to that record of that deliberative process. So when we use halakhah this way to talk about basically a genre of literature, we're talking primarily about the Talmud, and I've brought already, today one example, and have over the course of this course so far brought several examples. The Talmud is composed of basically two documents, composed of the Mishnah first, which was originally an independent document compiled about 220 CE, which I like to refer to as basically the first layer of rabbinic interpretation on the written Torah. It's a collection of all sorts of pre-existing oral traditions. It was collected together and redacted in Hebrew in the land of Israel, basically because it draws on this tradition that predated the destruction of the temple in diaspora. So like I said, composed about 222, that's the Mishnah. And then when combined together with what we call the Gemara, which is compiled about the year 500, a subsequent layer further interpreting not only the Torah, but also the Mishnah itself. The Gemara was composed in Aramaic in Babylon, so already in the diaspora. When you combine those, Mishnah and Gemara, you get Talmud. And confusingly, a lot of times when people talk about Talmud, they call it by Gemara. So basically, when we say Gemara or we say Talmud, we're generally talking about the same thing. But for our purposes, we want to be precise here. The Talmud became basically the basis for all later halakhic discussions. This effort to bring together all the oral traditions, codify them, basically freeze them in time in such a way that they could be preserved and passed down over generations that were dispersed around the world. The Talmud is this huge document that became the essential text, the basis for everything that came after it. Additionally, when we talk about Halakhah in the sense of being the collective body of religious thought, we're also talking about what are usually just called the codes. So I highlighted 3 examples. If you're taking, notes, there's no test in this class or anything like that. But I picked 3, and there are many, many more. These are probably the 3 big ones, the 3 famous ones that if people are talking about one or the other of the codes, they're talking about one of these 3. The first, I would say, major code, although not the first attempt at codification of Halakhah, of this body of literature, was the Mishnah Torah that was composed by Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, more commonly known as either Maimonides or the Rambam, and his dates are there, 1135 to 1204. His was the first sort of code that caught on in a big popular way, and is still in certain circles like the go-to text for questions of Halakhah and questions of Jewish observance. He used a very kind of his system of organization was in some ways excellent, in some ways not that helpful. There were many, many different subject headings. The big innovation of Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher in his Arba Turim, are usually just called the Tur. Arba Turim means literally the 4 columns, and that's because it refers to its organization system. There are 4 big subject headings, which in one way is helpful, in another way is less precise and makes it harder to find. In any case, it's a different organizational system. It's another very influential law code, and basically every code that came after, including Yosef Karl's Shulchan Aruch, followed the Tur's organizational system. Basically, Mishnah Torah, the Tur, and the Shulchan Aruch are 3 of the main law codes that basically try to pull together everything that's in the Talmud, which in order to find the answer to any question there, you really have to study straight through. You have to kind of study the whole text of the Talmud in order to find any small answer. The attempt here with each of these is to distill that down to just the answers, just what they call the Psak Halakhah, the halakhic ruling that tells you what to do. Whatever your question is, the idea is you should be able to track it down in one of these codes. And so when we talk about Halakhah, we're frequently talking about those halakhic rulings that come from these major codes. Okay, that was a lot of information in one fell swoop. So I want to take a pause for questions. What questions do you have so far about definitions of Halakhah or the codes or anything along those lines? Stephanie, you jumped up right away. What's your question? Go ahead.
Because it was brewing. So, and the bookshelf, the Talmud is what, 12 volumes or something like that?
Does it include... A bit more than that, yes. It takes up a whole shelf, though, yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. So does it include all 3 of these? No.
These are more like, some of these are substantially long themselves, the codes I talked about, but they're essentially digests of the Talmud.
Okay.
Whereas the Talmud itself is, follows this kind of flowing style that's almost a stream of consciousness sometimes. Remember, the Talmud is a writing down of oral traditions, and the way oral traditions are transmitted is usually by mnemonic. So in the Talmud, you'll get things like, there are 7, there'll be a list of 7 things, and then the Talmud will be like, okay, as long as we're listing things that come in 7s, here's a bunch of other lists of 7 things to make it easier to remember. Now, they're not topically related that way, but it makes sense if you're a student trying to memorize it to learn it that way. So what the codes do is go back and take that and organize them topically. So if you have a question about Shabbat, you can go to the section on Shabbat. You have a question about Kashrut, you can go to the section on Kashrut and track down the ruling that you need there. So it's more like a digest or something like that.
So is the Shulchan Aruch the latest or the general one that's used then for reference?
It depends who you talk to. So one of the things we'll get into, and actually the direction I'm going next, is why Halakhah as Jewish law isn't a great translation, and that's part of the reason, is because these are all Halakhah, but they actually have different things to say about particular points. Sometimes these rabbis would rule differently. They'd read all the same material in the Talmud and the other classic sources and end up coming to a different decision. Now, that doesn't make any sense if you're thinking of law in the sense of American law. It's whatever the Supreme Court rules. That's the law, right? There's no equivalent to that when it comes to Jewish praxis. So different communities prefer one or the other. In fact, like the Shulchan Aruch, for example, is Yosef Karo was a Sephardi Jew, and different the ethnic communities, the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim, sometimes had different traditions. So Karo's Shulchan Aruch is never published without another commentary right along with it, which is the commentary of the Ramah, an Ashkenazi rabbi who basically goes back, immediately and lays down a stricter ruling than whatever Karo said, because the Ashkenazis are often more strict.
Okay.
So it like a lot of questions, it depends who you ask. Yeah. Other questions? What else can I help you understand about Halakhah in either the sense of being normative Jewish practice or this collection of literature? You can type your question or come off of mute. Okay. We'll go on then.
Phil, I have a quick question.
Oh, please, go ahead, Peg. Yeah.
Is the tour online or is the Talmud online?
Yes.
Where?
So actually, it's good that I have this.
It must be in Sefaria. I bet.
So right there in the middle, it says "Made with Sefaria Source Sheet Builder." www.sefaria.org.
I should. Yeah.
This is obviously a digression, but excellent question, because I love directing people to this website. It's an amazing project, basically trying to digitize all of Jewish literature in one place. So if you go to sefaria.org, you'll see basically genre labels. You'll see Tanakh, you'll see Mishnah, you'll see Talmud, you'll see Midrash. You can click any of those. If you click the Halakhah label, it'll take you to basically all of the codes of Halakhah. So that's a good way to illustrate that when we're talking about Halakhah, we're not talking about Talmud exactly, as a genre label. We're talking about these codes. I'm pretty sure Mishnah Torah is listed first. The Torah and the Shulchan Aruch are there as well. I'm not sure if these ones are in English. You would have to look that up. Their translation is available for a lot of stuff, including all of the Talmud. And it's searchable, which is great. So you don't even have to use their organization systems. You can just type the term you want and track it down that way on Sefaria. Thanks for asking, Peg.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone wants a walkthrough of how to use that website or anything like that, let me know. It's a really powerful tool for rabbis and regular Jews of all stripes alike. Okay. So like I said, Halakhah is frequently, the term is frequently translated as Jewish law, but I don't particularly think that's a great translation. Rabbi Green agrees. There's a lot of often very serious Jews who don't think that's a great translation. So the main reason why I don't think Halakhah as Jewish law makes a lot of sense is because Halakhah lacks the power of coercion. Historically speaking, in diasporic communities, particularly isolated communities in places like Eastern Europe or even Spain, North Africa, Halakhah, in terms of Jewish practice, it served as an enforceable avenue of law. Basically, the leaders of these isolated Jewish communities, where the secular or Christian or Muslim authorities basically left them alone, the leaders of the community had basically authority to enforce adherence to Halakhah. But prior to the diaspora and basically after the Jewish Enlightenment, that hasn't been really the case. When you're a Jew in an isolated community and the leader says you have to obey this point of Halakhah or we'll banish you, you basically have to obey, because where are you going to go, right? No other community is going to take you in. They had enough sort of a punishment mechanism to enforce Halakhah, basically as law. But since roughly the beginning or the late 18th century, in Europe, where, as a result of the Enlightenment, Jews became recognized and entitled to equality and citizenship, that coercive power was basically transferred to the civil law of wherever, Jews lived. So, just as today, I, as the rabbi of the Jewish community in Corvallis, have no power to, compel anyone to act a certain way with regard to, religious Jewish behavior. That's basically, the way it is, the way it is now all over outside of, very isolated Orthodox communities. Only the secular authorities have the power to compel your behavior. So they are enforcers of law. In as much as I'm, capable of discussing and ruling on matters of Halakhah, I don't have any power to compel compliance with my rulings. So Halakhah as law doesn't really make a lot of sense, in the sense that, I practice and observe it. Rabbi Green notes in his chapter that Halakhah, especially in our modern world, is quite different from that enforceable, law. We choose to follow it out of personal commitment. It's our way of expressing such deep feelings as love of God, our attachment to the legacy of the Jewish people, our sense of the need to apply our spiritual beliefs to our conduct, in even the most mundane and human affairs. So, as we transition to the kind of the last section of this class, where we talk about this idea as it's expressed in Jewish life and practice, like I said, this is sort of a funny one, because there are Jews for whom that question, how does this idea, Halakhah, connect to Jewish life and practice, that would make no sense. Their answer would be, well, Halakhah is Jewish life and practice, right? Going back to our previous definition, Halakhah is the normative praxis of Judaism. It's the same thing, they would say, right? Of course they're right, but they react that way because they've already understood themselves to be engaged with customary Jewish practice through attention to, and at least to some degree, conformity with Halakhah, with the second definition of Halakhah as that body of religious thought that's been set down in these codes, right? So they're already engaging with this Halakhah, which is why to them this definition, the normative practice, makes sense. However, my expectation is, just given what I know about the community at Corvallis and the kind of folks who come to my sessions, my expectation is that a lot of folks joining or watching this session don't understand themselves to be engaged with customary Jewish practice, at least not in this way, in terms of engagement with these law codes or these codes of Halakhah. You're not necessarily going to look what Caro or Rambam has to say about your Jewish practice, right? So I want to offer 4 elements of what Halakhah is or might be for any of us as Jews who are not necessarily already deeply engaged with this genre of literature. Basically, approaches that can bring about a kind of reclaiming of the terms Halakhah and halachic in support of a modern, forward-looking, and frankly pluralistic Judaism. Now, I'm under the influence here of a couple of people. For one thing, my classmate at Hebrew College, he was in my graduating class, Rabbi Ayalon Eliach. He's now, he works at New York at the Lippmann Kampfer Institute for Jewish Life, something like that. It's basically a Jewish think tank. He is one of the very smartest people I know. He was a lawyer before he went to religious school, and so he brings a really, very sharp perspective to this. But his job is basically to think about questions like this. How can modern Jews interact with Halakhah? He laid out sort of his approach to Halakhah on a podcast that I would highly recommend. It's called Judaism Unbound, and I'm happy to share that link. I can share it at the end of the session if you'd like to check it out. Judaism Unbound, where the two hosts, Dan Liebenson and Lex Rofberg, discuss all sorts of contemporary Jewish issues, have these guests on to talk about all sorts of new and current ideas. So Rabbi Eliach was on Judaism Unbound probably about a year ago or so. I'm happy to share that link, like I said, and they're talking about basically these ideas. Oh, somebody's got it for us there. Thank you in the chat box. Okay, so basically these four elements of what Halakhah could be for us are proposed by one of the hosts, Dan Liebenson, and I alone, Rabbi Eliach, basically agrees with the first three and takes an issue with the fourth. I frankly agree with I alone. I'm going to lay these out for you and then kind of put it to you to see what you think, and if any of and to hear back from you if any of this makes sense to you, moves you, somehow resonates with you. Okay. So basically, 4 elements what Halakhah is or could be. Dan Liebenson proposes one, Halakhah as concerned with all of Jewish life. Basically, not just concerned with what goes on in the synagogue, but really a comprehensive approach to what it is to live a life, as a Jewish person, but to live a Jewish life in all aspects of your life. So covering your trips to the store and your work and what goes on in your home, as well as what happens in synagogue. So Halakhah is concerned with all of Jewish life. Number 2, Halakhah as ancient wisdom taken seriously and approached with a lens of curiosity as opposed to a lens of suspicion. Frequently, I think it's a modern habit to approach ancient sources who, lots of times lived in very different worlds, had very different value systems, to approach those texts with a degree of suspicion. Halakhah here, Dan Liebenson proposes ancient wisdom we take seriously with a lens of curiosity about what can this teach us, what can this say to us. Third, Halakhah as Jewish values translated into habitual practice. And I think this is a key piece of Halakhah as I understand it. It's not always just what do you do on one occasion. Halakhah concerns itself, with in a comprehensive way, about Jewish life, not just in one-off circumstances, but as a habit. What do I eat on a day in, day out basis? What do I do for work every day, and how do I go about that work on a day in, day out basis? So Halakhah is Jewish values translated into habits, habitual practice. Fourth, and this is one where Liebenson proposes an idea, and I alone, Rabbi Eliach, disagrees, and I think I would too. They debate Halakhah as a system as opposed to kind of a grab bag of rituals and practices we like. Liebenson proposes Halakhah is a system that creates kind of a coherence to our way of walking through the world. It bounds the Jewish people and also binds our community together. I think an example of what Dan Liebenson is talking about here. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I can't tell who's sharing these links. Oh, is that all Peg? Thank you, Peg. Very good. You're like my teacher assistant here with all the links ready to go. So what Liebenson is proposing here is basically a coherent system such that what you do on Shabbat has to do with some way with what you eat. And when we talk about bounding and binding the Jewish community, we're talking about communal norms of behavior that sort of enable Jews to recognize each other and to recognize what makes Jews different from non-Jews. So something like, not working on Shabbat in all the ways that's expressed. Not doing your job, but also not driving, perhaps, or using electronics. Those ideas in terms of being a system of behavior bind Jews together, because it means you have people to meet to go on a Shabbat walk, right? But it also puts a bit of a bound around the Jewish community in that we don't go to work on Shabbat, right? We can't, someone who's Shabbat observant in that way can't go do a job that demands they work on Saturdays, right? Now there are a lot of Jews that look at Halakhah as a system, and I'm not going to argue that that's wrong. That's not at all what I'm arguing. But Halakhah, in terms of how I understand it, and how I think it can be really usefully applied in the interest of Jewish pluralism, which ties really into what goes on at Beit and Corvallis. Here's Rabbi Eliach's critique of that idea of Halakhah as a system. So he doesn't believe there necessarily needs to be sort of systematic aspect to this. Ayalon thinks of Halakhah as basically a shared discourse. There's not an assumption in a shared discourse that you need to arrive at the same conclusions. So basically, more than one Jew could look into Halakhah at, for example, what do I do on Shabbat? Consider all the same sources, all the same ideas about what should be permitted, what should be prohibited, and more than one Jew could come up with their own answer, and those answers could look different. His sort of backup, his insight for why he thinks Halakhah doesn't need to be a system but prefers an idea of shared discourse comes from actually the early beginnings of the rabbinic movement. So remember those rabbis who were pulling together oral traditions and writing them down into what became the Mishnah? For them, there was no such thing as a single Halakhah. There was no one source that knew knew the whole discourse in such a way that it could rule, absolutely comprehensively. When Halakhah is first introduced as a concept, as a way of being, there were essentially individual leaders. Many of them used the title rabbi, which just means my teacher. Individual leaders who were experimenting, doing things differently than one another. They were united not by their shared practice, not that they all did exactly the same thing on Shabbat or all ate the same way or whatever it was, but they were united around this shared discourse of discussing what it means to practice Shabbat and what that can look like and what it means to eat in accordance with both the written Torah's ideas about how one should eat and also the oral Torah's ideas about how one should eat. And we've kind of lost that idea over time. I think partly because Halakhah became law, or became understood as law. In that, at least for a while, it was enforced. Behavior, was coerced. But it didn't start out that way. Basically, the early rabbis didn't have that coercive power. They lived for the most part, under Roman rule, and the Romans were the ones with the coercive power to make you do something or not do something. All the rabbis had was power of persuasion. The only way they could get anyone else to do like them was to convince them that it was a good idea. That power of coercion, like I said, came later. And at that point, we see this kind of narrowing of approaches where there's this enforcement mechanism, when there's some sort of enforcement about what you can or can't do on Shabbat. We see people start to converge around the accepted norms of traditional Shabbat practice that we basically now know as an Orthodox Shabbat, right? But prior to that, there was this proliferation. And Rabbi Eliach, and I would agree with this, would kind of like to see a proliferation of approaches to Halakhah where people are living rigorously, taking this seriously, but in a lot of different ways, where we're learning from each other, but learning from the differences in our practices, and learning from the process of how we got to constructing those practices. And he thinks it's possible some people will gravitate together, but he's not necessarily expecting there'll be a single new halakhah for all of Judaism. He'd like to would like people to think about their Judaism, even if it's entirely, different from others, in terms of how tradition can inform rituals and behaviors throughout their lives. To take that seriously and to invest in the process that was basically begun 2,000 plus years ago of raising questions, looking to bring a Jewish approach to all sorts of novel circumstances, looking into the tradition and, finding your own way to resolve for yourself, how to both be loyal to tradition and act meaningfully for you in the present. Okay, that was a lot. So I want to review a little bit, and then I want to see what you react to, what resonates with you. Liebenson proposes Halakhah as something concerned with all of our lives, as a comprehensive system of living. Halakhah as ancient wisdom taken seriously and approached with curiosity. Halakhah as Jewish values that are transferred into habitual practice. And then either Halakhah as something systematic or something more like a shared discourse where we're all invested in a similar project, but potentially coming up with different answers. So I'm curious, especially if there are folks who either already are invested in Halakhah or are new to this, what to that speaks to you, or do you feel like could potentially serve as a guide for you? Rachel, thanks so much for being brave and taking yourself off mute. What would you like to share?
Well, actually, I have a question, and
Okay, go ahead.
I'm wondering what in Liebenson's approach is at all different from what Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan and the Reconstructionists formulated, like a century or so ago?
Mm-hmm. You'd have to ask Dan Liebenson, and to be honest, I'm not sure if he's arguing this for himself, so much as arguing in order to, to interact with Ilo and Elia, but Mordecai can't. So I would say the part that's very much the same is the idea that it's concerned with all of life. That one of Mordecai Kaplan's big ideas is Judaism is this religious civilization, right? That has to do with all sorts of aspects of what individuals Jews do with their lives. Whether he would have agreed with the part of that's Halakhah is a system that where we converge on ideas of behavior. My guess is he would have seen the logic of that too. I think that Kaplan's idea was basically that communities would sort of create Halakhah for themselves, and that's frequently what you see in affiliated Reconstructionist communities, where the community as sort of a body will look into tradition and chart its way forward, in new circumstances, as opposed to individuals doing that, if that makes sense. So that community might end up with an approach that's different from another Reconstructionist community, but it's sort of done at the community level as opposed to the individual level, which is, I think, probably more pluralistic than orthodoxy, where the expectation is everyone is doing it and they're looking to to a particular rabbinic authority to guide them, but not as pluralistic as, say, what goes on at Beit, where, to some extent, we saw there are certain cases where we all have to kind of do the same thing in order to get along together, but in general, it's much more individualized. I think. Does that help answer a little bit?
That's helpful. I guess I was thinking specifically of the past has a vote, not a veto, which is
yeah. Okay.
And that sounds very much. But no, what you said also is relevant.
Right.
That's where that was the first thing that struck me, hearing your description of what Liebenson proposes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So that's interesting. It does seem to me that it's a good approach to, and I'm not proposing this for Beit, but what you just described as Reconstructionist communities doing, it sounds like they're sort of as a congregation or a community agreeing this is what we're going to do, at least maybe not at home, but maybe,
Mhm.
in their common space.
Right.
And that's a prerequisite. Otherwise you don't have a community.
So that is one of the central critiques of Rabbi Elias's approach. And actually, there's another episode, I think maybe 2 or 3 before his episode, where I think Leon Wiener Dow, who is not a rabbi, but a scholar in Israel who thinks about this in kind of the secular Renaissance movement there, and really proposes Halakhah as system. And his main argument is basically, you need to, at some point, converge around practice. Otherwise, the community is going to start to lose coherence.
Right.
That's, I think, admittedly, a solid critique. That said, I've been a part of pluralistic communities that, put that to the test and still remain together.
Mm-hmm.
Hebrew College is a great example. We had to figure out how to, make sure the microwave was kosher in the cafeteria. Not actually as hard as you think it is, but even though people ate whatever they wanted, we sort of still had to figure out how to hang together, even though practice may have looked different. So I can see that logic, but I think also there's a real advantage to pluralism in that each individual is able to make meaning for themselves and construct a practice that's meaningful for them. It is admittedly challenging to then come together in community and figure out what are we going to do together as a community. That's really one of the central tensions today in Jewish religious communities. Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. I know there was a lot. Are there other thoughts or reactions? Anne, please, thanks.
Yeah, so I'm kind of trying to think about this within the context of today's conversation, which is really about unconscious bias, right? And so is there a kind of structure here that can help us with uncovering that or dealing with that or working with that in some way?
Structure for
that
dealing
might
with
be a bit of a
unconscious bias
stretch, but
through Halakhah. Interesting question. I mean, so I'm certain that there are Jewish thinkers who have thought about this question of unconscious bias. And I think one of the Halakhah as a practice, as a comprehensive practice would sort of demand that, when faced with a new idea, the idea that we might be sort of unknowingly biased in all sorts of, potentially racist ways, part of doing what's good and right and imitating God as best we can would demand us then to try to address that from a Jewish framework, looking back into our sources and seeing what they have to teach us about how to address that. So to try to answer that question, I don't know exactly what Halakhah would have to say about how to address unconscious bias, but I think it would suggest that we need to. Does that kind of help?
Yeah, because if it's all part of sort of Jewish living and
Right.
the way to live,
Right.
that's integral to that whole conversation. So
right. Yeah, exactly. Right. In terms of what we might be able to find in the halakhic literature, that's going to be another class. I'm going to have to do some thinking and research, and I'm sure there's other people smarter than me out there doing that already. Any other thoughts, questions, things along those lines? Is this does anyone feel like they have been introduced to something entirely new here, or is anything potentially, I don't know, inspiring or affecting your practice of Judaism at all?
What I think about, Phil, is
Yeah.
when I came to Corvallis way over 40 years ago, coming from the Bay Area, which is, Reform, conservative, Orthodox, 40 years ago. It is
Right.
no longer.
Right.
But at that time period, coming into this community and seeing a totally different approach to community life, as we call it, the Beit way, which is pluralism, was a real eye-opener in all of the best ways possible for me. And I think that we struggle with that on occasion throughout the years, but we always come back to that foundation. And I find that tremendously not only encouraging, but also very affirming in reading this particular chapter, thinking of
Yeah.
Halakhah,
Mhm.
I walk this way, maybe you walk that way.
Yeah.
But there's still a walking that has some commonality.
Right.
I find it very affirming.
Me too. There's something about this approach that really speaks to me too, and it is admittedly very challenging. And like the best I've been able to figure is sort of how, if you have a different practice, your study and your you're looking into sources produces an actual practice that's different from mine. How can I take yours seriously is frequently the question. And it really comes down to sort of whether or not I respect the extent to which you've done the homework, basically. This I think is the Hebrew college student in me speaking, is like, honestly, the only answer that's not acceptable is I haven't thought about it yet. Right? It doesn't, like, at some point, and they're almost certainly, harder lines than this, but like, to an extent, when it comes to, like, what you eat, for example, the only question, the only answer that's unacceptable is I haven't thought it through. I haven't gone and learned yet. But if you figure out a way to eat pork, like, I would acknowledge that's at least plausible. It'd be a tough sell, but like, in theory, that should be defensible and some.
On an individual level, but
Right.
then on a community level, in our common spaces, obviously
have
we
to
would
figure
not.
out how to eat together, right? Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Jessica, thanks so much for your patience raising your hand. What would you like to share or say?
Mute. Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you all for having me. I'm Ann Fairbrother's sister, and I
hi.
don't live in Philadelphia. I live in Albuquerque.
Oh, wonderful. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. This is very interesting, and I'm interested in this. I was really struck by your notion of the interaction between praxis, which actually comes. I learned a lot about that looking at Marxist studies.
Okay.
Use that word.
Okay.
Praxis or practice, or how we actualize this in our daily lives, and the code, and with the more formal kind of backdrop to the praxis. So that interaction, and I can see very well how that could lead to the evolution of a community over time, as has happened with Judaism. But where and how is that interaction between praxis and the code resolved? Is it at the community level? Is it at the higher Jewish community level?
Yeah.
I mean, it has to all come together.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. And if I'm on the wrong track, let me know. But so there's no sort of equivalent in Judaism of like a pope or whatever. There's no like ultimate authority who makes a ruling and then on. So it's basically roughly the community level. There's a sort of a common saying, like if you go read if you go look up answers to questions on Chabad.org, Chabad, an Orthodox religious organization, they'll tell you what Chabad thinks, and at the bottom it'll say, consult your rabbi. And ultimately, that's where the resolution comes from, is who is your rabbi. And that's frequently a geographic or community-based thing, although it's also sort of an ideological or philosophical thing. Who is the rabbi who I'm going to say is the authority, the one who rules authoritatively for me personally? And what that looks like is frequently you'll have different communities with different rabbis who do things differently and like can't stand each other and can't get along because they're, you know, they're arguing over some points. But on an individual level, at least, that's where, at least in an Orthodox framework, that's where you look for that ultimate sort of arbitration, is who's your rabbi, who's deciding for me and my community.
Yes, but without, as you point out, the sort of ultimate arbiter like
Right.
a pope, that
Right.
has the potential to lead to a very fractured community.
And yeah, and I would say it has in some circumstances.
Okay, I'm just interested in sort of what keeps Judaism then from sort of flying apart. My rabbi says it's okay to eat pork. Your rabbi says it's not.
Right.
And over time, we can't even eat together anymore.
Right. I'd say, like, the pork thing is a little, almost,
Well, I know. Yeah.
Right. That's like almost an absurd example, but I think a more realistic one is let's examine the difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi practice on Passover, and who eats what on Passover, right?
Right.
The Ashkenazim avoid kitniot, which are the things that are not chametz but are sort of chametz adjacent, and the Sephardi would eat them. Now that becomes a problem once a year when maybe they want to eat at the same table. So, so there's an example of that kind of split.
Right.
But yet we still all consider one another Jews, or at least I would hope that we all consider one another Jews.
Right.
There's a real kind of dynamic tension here in like allowing enough freedom to look into sources and choose for yourself, or at least for rabbis to choose for their communities, right? There's a tension in between that and how can we hang together and continue to take each other seriously, right? And continue to look at other Jews and see Judaism reflected back, as we know it, reflected back at us. Yeah, it's an ongoing tension, and
it's also very powerful because that's what allowed Judaism to evolve over the centuries and millennia.
Exactly.
But remain coherent in many ways.
Yeah, can you imagine if it was there was like such a thing as a Jewish pope who sort of ruled on everything for everyone, like it would be not nearly such a diverse and vibrant kind of fabric of community life. We wouldn't have this incredible variation, right? Not the Catholics and their practice, they're great and should all live and be well, but there's a way that doesn't make any sense for Judaism, right?
Yeah.
But
okay.
Yeah,
that's good.
I would say it's an issue. I think it's almost an issue exacerbated by the existence of Israel now, where the religious and sort of coercive authority has been kind of remarried with civil authority to some extent, where the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel has legal power invested in it. It's a divisive issue. The issue of marriage. There's only religious marriage in Israel, right? It's a divisive issue there, and it's tough for liberal Jews like me, for me to look over there and see Judaism as I live and understand it reflected back at me. Sometimes I look over there and see something too systematic, too coercive a lot of the time, and can be really challenging.
And of course, that's not the whole country. That's a strata.
You're absolutely right. Just a very visible one. If anything, I've learned is that whatever the sort of most visible strata in Israel is not the story all the way down.
Oh no, not nowhere near.
And thank you, Jessica. That was a wonderful question, a wonderful discussion. Anyone else, other questions or thoughts or anything you'd like to share? Wonderful. Oh, Stephanie, go ahead.
Well, I'm finding it interesting because as one who is in the process of converting and coming to recognize what I have experienced at Beit without necessarily all of the exposure to Halakhah, then this has been an education in terms of, okay, I was aware of all of the various and sundry rules.
Sure.
And trying to think about, okay, which ones kind of do I think about trying to incorporate in my life
Yeah.
as part. And so this has all been, I was reading the chapter ahead of time and thinking, oh, okay, this gives me some guidelines.
Yeah. It can be tough, I would say, both as the rabbi of a pluralistic community and as a member of a pluralistic community. You know, I have discussions with my peers frequently about, you know, when do we sort of just tell people exactly what they need to know? You know, they ask a question, Rabbi, what do I do on this? And when do you just tell them? You know, when you sort of use that sort of rabbinic voice or authority, and when do you open it up and say, well, here's what Rambam says, and here's what Karo says, and here's what, you know, all these other people say, and sort of help them construct the practice for yourself, which is, you know, I think what we like to do in all circumstances, and is sometimes just not practical. Or so a person might not be, you know, there yet or ready for that, or whatever. And I imagine it's tough frequently to come to a rabbi like me looking for an answer and getting questions back. So if you're occasionally frustrated with me for not telling you giving you a simple answer, at least you know why I'm interested in trying to help you open up these sources and things like that, and you know, forge your way for yourself. Well, I'm not necessarily going to tell you what to do. It stems from this idea of how I understand Halakhah, basically. Thank you, Stephanie, and it's wonderful to have you here, and excited to keep working with you on your journey. Anyone else? Is there anything else anyone would like to share? Questions to ask? I want to give a quick shout out to Dan Elefant, who has been, at least thus far, been creating really beautiful artworks where I think it's watercolors. Dan, you can weigh in if I'm wrong. It looks like watercolor to me, and he's been painting the subject of each session in watercolor, and he's been sending them to me, and I asked him for permission to make them the thumbnails on the YouTube videos when they go up on the YouTube channel, and he gave me my permission. So if you look at the playlist for Awesome Ideas in Judaism, you can see some beautiful Dan Elefant artworks. And hopefully we'll have one more after this. I guess he's pledged to this and 7 more after. We'll see about that.